Well, Kamal, you're saying there were some winners from the budget, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, and let's not let Rachel Reeves off too lightly. Let's just start by listening back to this answer that Rachel Reeves gave to a Bloomberg reporter before the election happened.
Rachel, Labour has ruled out, as you say, increasing income tax, VAT, corporation tax, national insurance, but you use this language of having no plans when asked about capital gains tax, wealth taxes, other property taxes, inheritance tax. Do you use the words no plans because it gives you the space in government to then say, well, we didn't have plans then, but we do have plans now because we've seen the state of the public finances and we see that this is necessary to fix public services?
No, I'm under no illusions about the scale of the challenge that I will face. I don't need to become Chancellor to know what a mess the government have made of public finances, of public services, and the fact that the tax burden is at its highest level in 70 years. We don't need high taxes. What we need is growth. And I don't want to, and I have no plans to increase any taxes beyond those which we have already set out. The VAT and business rates on private schools, the extension of the windfall tax, the changes about how private equity bosses are taxed, and the policies that we have announced, the non-doms as well. Those are the only changes to tax that we need to fund our plans. I'm very clear about that. I want to grow our economy because that is the only way that we can sustainably improve living standards, have the money for public services, and also keep taxes as low as we possibly can. That is what I'm determined to do, to grow the economy, not to do what the Conservatives have done, which is to increase taxes 26 times, including capital gains tax, during the course of this Parliament. Taxes are at a 70-year high. I do not want the tax burden to rise further. I want the tax burden to fall. But unlike the Conservatives, I am not willing to make policy commitments, whether that's on tax or on spending, without being able to say where the money is going to come from. The problem is the Conservatives know the money is not there. They're committing it anyway because they are desperate. And if they had a chance with 5 more years to implement these proposals, the only thing that would happen is that families pay more on their mortgages.
Oh, it's almost wincing, Gordon. That clip will be played time and time again. It's very easy, isn't it? There's so much information in a budget. You dive down into the detail. You want to look at who's affected and how, which we're going to be getting onto, as you said in the intro. Farmers, if you have a pension, if you happen to be in work. I mean, that's pretty much all of us in any case.
Yeah.
But there is a big underlying point I think both of us just want to land again about trust and what politicians say. There is Rachel Reeves being so clear. Read my lips. No new taxes. We don't need higher taxes. She said something very similar about never changing the borrowing rules. That is in the context of a party that also told the nation, we are going to be different. And so it's sort of doubled down on the mistrust problem. And I think in the end, Gordon, we can all slightly raise our eyebrows and say, oh, all politicians, obviously they lie. Isn't that terrible? That's what people think. But I think it really undermines the body politic if the party in government does something so different from what it said so clearly before the election.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting listening to that clip, how shaky her voice was. Is that because she knew she was fibbing, or is it because she feared she might be having to completely do a huge U-turn on what she had just said once she became Chancellor? If she
the psychological, I think you're absolutely right, actually, Gordon. The psychological tell when you're saying something that you're not convinced yourself is authentic.
She was stuttering. Her voice sounded very, very shaky.
Very clever question from the Bloomberg journalist as well about the plans to. Yeah.
So we've heard until we're tired of hearing it, haven't we? This phrase about not taxing working people. They can't say what working people are, as we know. And then come the budget, we've had £40 billion worth of tax rises, the largest of those being this increase in employers' national insurance contributions, which does rather feel like a tax on people who are working. And then today we've had Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, an independent body, saying that rise in NI and the budget altogether, really, he said the pretense that it would not affect working people risks undermining trust. So,
and the
Paul
IFS
Johnson.
are no critic of the Labour government. I mean, actually, Paul Johnson did say that they would have actually directly broken their promise. Now, Camilla is on a very well-earned holiday with her children. I hope she forgives me for this, but I just want to make a sort of broader point, stepping back. She sometimes said I tend to go into a bit of a TED talk, so I'll try and keep this short. But I think there is a really significant thing that has happened that we have seen, which is actually era-defining. So if you think to yourself, Second World War, my mother's generation coming out of the Second World War, she was born in the Second World War. This idea that the state would provide was very much part of the agreement between the public and government. That the government, which would bring together the government, organised labour in the form of the unions and business, what's called the tripartite system. And that lasted pretty much uninterrupted from 1945 to 1979. That consensus broke down with the 1970s, winter of discontent, high inflation, high borrowing. We could almost not borrow on the international markets. We were so indebted. We've mentioned the Dennis Healey budgets of the 1970s. Which
the lights
Jeremy
going
Hunt,
off.
Yeah, the lights going off.
I remember it.
Jeremy Hunt saying we were at risk of going back to as bad a moment as that in his interview with us earlier this week. But that consensus held 1945 to 1979, broke down in 1979 for the reasons we've said. Margaret Thatcher comes in with a new consensus, which is the market will provide. Allow entrepreneurialism to flourish, wealth creation. That creates the tax revenues you need, smaller state and private enterprise.
And low taxes.
And lower taxes. Blair holds to that broad consensus and puts what might be described as a patina of social justice on top of that. But he broadly agreed with the argument. The Thatcher-Blair consensus was the market will provide as long as there's social justice. That held until the financial crisis and after. It has ended. We are back to the idea with this budget that the state will provide in partnership with first organised labour in the form of unions. We've got a whole load of new workers' rights coming down the track. And business is third of three.
Yeah.
That is a significant moment that I think, I said yesterday before the budget that Rachel Reeves was looking at being one of the most consequential chancellors of the century.
Yeah.
She wanted yesterday to be one of those moments that you would go back and say, that was the moment, like the arrival of Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe, who was her first chancellor. And actually, it wasn't the first budget that made a lot of the changes. It was actually slightly subsequent budgets after 1979 that made the huge changes. Then, of course, Nigel Lawson. Rachel Reeves sees herself in that position. So although Gordon Brown and Tony Blair did a huge amount, they didn't completely change the fundamental relationship between voter and government. Rachel Reeves has done that. The state is now much bigger. Organised Labour's influence is much better in the form of unions, much bigger in the form of unions, and third is business. And that is really significant.
Yeah, and I think the stats are that the state now accounts for, is it 44% now of GDP we're talking about, which seems almost impossibly large to me, given that it is the private sector which creates the wealth in the first place that the state then relies on. The tax burden going up to 38.2% of GDP, which is an all-time high. And again, to quote Paul Johnson, he said, the state has grown and it seems unlikely to shrink again anytime soon. So it does feel as though we are now living in a big state, high-tax country, and whether that's ever going to change is a question.
Rachel Reeves has made a big bet that the public want it. The public want this type of levels of investment, these levels of taxes, and now she's got to produce, I think, remarkable performance in the public services for people to say, OK, it is worth it. And obviously they're not getting that at the moment. So let's see how that develops.
Yeah.
Let's
Can
go
I
to-
just
oh, yes,
say?
go on, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, her sum. You're talking about this big bet that we need to, needs to come to fruition. But we're already seeing her sums unravelling, aren't we? We've had people like the IFS and the OBR saying that the 25 billion that she says she's going to raise from putting up employers' national insurance contributions is actually 16 billion because the wages will go down, which means that she will have a lower tax take from wages. That sounds a bit like a £9 billion black hole in her sums. Well,
Maybe she could ask the Office for Budget Responsibility to hold an inquiry. Who knows?
Sounds like a good idea.
I just want to let's go to you because, of course, as ever with our wonderful Telegraph family, you are not only very thoughtful but often incredibly witty. We wanted to go to a few of the letters to the editor. One of my favourite parts of the Telegraph environment, and to Jane Moth from Stone in Staffordshire, and she says, "Sir, I had not realised that the government's interest in assisted dying extended to the economy."
I was very struck by a letter from Emily Lockyer in Warwick, who said, she said, as I was mulling the inventive ways that Labour will seize my hard-earned money, I wondered why running the country is the only thing you don't need a qualification for. And she goes on to describe the fact that she's 28, she and her friends are doctors, lawyers, accountants and so on, and they have to keep on taking exams. She makes the point that in a lot of jobs, including accountancy, they have a fail one and you're out policy. And she says, what would happen if we gave ministers an exam of their own, with business and economics taking centre stage and a sprinkling of domestic and foreign policy for good measure? I suppose they'd need to be given more than one chance to pass, or our cabinet might start looking very lean indeed. Pass the paper back.
I do like the idea. I do like the idea of a sort of a test
austerity
that they have maybe every year, because I think Rachel Reeves did say this is one slightly better thing. I thought Rachel Reeves did say that they're going to report back to the public every year about these new investments, and also they are going to have a productivity target, which means hopefully there will be greater productivity out of the public sector. But then, just to finish this little section on our wonderful letter writers, this one from Lauren Groom from Salisbury in Wiltshire. She says, "Sir, why oh why didn't Jeremy Hunt abolish inheritance tax when he had the chance? It just got considerably worse and amounts to a brutal confiscation of family assets. Please God, I live long enough to see out this lot, but it will be a close run thing." Well, we hope, Lauren, you're in good health, and we hope you do last until maybe at least the next election, because then who knows what might happen.
And maybe she'll avoid inheritance tax altogether.
One group who have been very upset by what happened in the budget are farmers. What has Rachel Reeves said is going to be the change?
So until now, farms have effectively been exempt from an inheritance tax. That recognises the fact that particularly small family farms, they are passed on down the generations. It means that that helps things like food security. What Rachel Reeves has now decided is that farms should pay inheritance tax. The rate at which that is going to happen is that if a farm is worth more than £1 million in total, they will pay effectively 20% inheritance tax on anything more than £1 million. So if a farm is worth £2 million, they would have to write a cheque to the Treasury for £200,000, which, as I'm sure people realise, most small farms don't have that sort of money just sitting in a bank account.
And what effect could that have on the whole sector?
Well, what the farming sector is saying is that the only way that farmers are going to be able to pay that sort of money to the Treasury is by selling land. So farms will get smaller, they'll become less efficient, it'll make food production more expensive, which obviously will have a knock-on effect on all of us. It will affect food security, because if farms are not economical, we'll end up importing more food from abroad. And as we've heard from both Tory and Lib Dem MPs, they are saying this could be the end of the family farm.
Jeremy Clarkson, whose Cotswold farm Diddley Squat is obviously part of that hugely popular Amazon Prime series, Clarkson's Farm. He was one of many people who condemned the Chancellor's decision to cut back on inheritance tax relief. He tweeted, "Farmers, I know that you have been shafted today, but please don't despair. Just look after yourselves for 5 short just look after yourselves for 5 short years, and this shower will be gone. Question is, I suppose, Gordon, will this be much more serious, of course, but will this be the pasty tax moment? Will Labour understand that although farming is a relatively small part of the economy, it is absolutely vital part of the economy, and also this is a group that maybe hasn't traditionally voted Labour? Do you think there could be any whiff of a U-turn on this? Because they just haven't realised the very negative effect it could have on farming communities.
Yeah, I think it could be. For a start, it doesn't actually raise a huge amount of money for the Treasury. I think they've estimated this will raise hundreds of millions, which is money that they could find elsewhere. And when you get someone like Jeremy Clarkson starting a very public campaign, you can imagine the next series of Clarkson's Farm might be very heavy on hammering Rachel Reeves. I think she could find herself in trouble very quickly.
We're joined now by James Robinson. He's a dairy farmer in Cumbria. James, thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea. Tell us a little bit about your farm and your family.
Yeah, so I'm really lucky that my family's been here at Strictly, which is the name of our farm, for 150 years next year. So next year is one of the big anniversaries, and we've had that continuity all that time as well. You know, so I'm the 5th generation, and my son Robert, who's probably outside there working in the rain, the 6th generation. I've also got my dad, who's the 4th, working with us as well. So there's 3 generations working on farm. Very much always had a passion for it. Love my cows. We're a dairy farm. We're organic. Try and do things nature-friendly farming as well. You know, try and make the farm a better place to be for each generation that comes along.
Can you just explain to us, James, what would happen to your farm, if, when you eventually pass it on to your family, this inheritance tax applied?
Without any planning, I think if it was, rather than it being a tax on inheritance, because I think with good planning, with good succession planning, which hopefully this will trigger most farms, or all farms, to actually do, because farmers are notoriously bad at actually talking about handing it over, even though it's always like an assumed thing. But it could be like a sudden death tax, really, which, you know, if a farm of our size would be probably liable for a tax bill of 400,000, something like that. So the £1 million threshold that it starts on is, which was, I think Rachel Reeves has sort of said it was to protect small family farms. Well, it isn't really a small farm. That's more of a small holding in a house in most areas of the country. The actual sort of sustainable sort of financially sound family farms are probably going to be around the 300 acre and around that sort of 3 million price tag on them. So you're tax liable on that 2 million. Now that wouldn't be achievable for us to be able to finance that £400,000 on a farm of our size. Profits are, on most farms are somewhere in the region of 1 to 2% on investment, so it's tiny percentage to try and find that 20%. Even though it is reduced down to that 20%, it would still be almost unachievable.
How did you feel when you heard the announcement yesterday? What effect do you think it has on farming communities?
I felt sick. I did. I read through the details and I skipped over a few bits and thought, it's all right, we're okay. And we've never felt this threat about the inheritance tax on agricultural holdings before. There was lots of rumours about it, and I kind of hoped that there were just rumours and it wouldn't happen. Once you read it, I did feel sick and it was incredibly raw. Once you start reading the details of it, it basically means we're going to have to plan. We're going to have to plan far, far better as an industry for the succession than we are doing at the moment. It's no good people near the end of their lives, 80 odd, and then suddenly deciding that they're going to have to write a will or they're going to have to talk to their children, which might be 60, and some family farmers have never actually written a check when they're 60-year-old. We call it writing a check, even though obviously we're not doing that now, but they've never had control of the businesses at all. So we need to really plan that far better. We need that vibrancy of youth, and that youth doesn't start at 60. It starts far, far younger than that. We're very lucky at our farm that we've always had that conversation. We didn't when my father took over from my grandfather, and because of that, we've realised that we can't go through that again. So we've had a conversation between my parents and me, and then me down to the next generation as well, which is Robert, who's just turned 20, really. So, we really have to start looking at bringing that youth on right into the business at the very start.
James, you look like someone who's got many decades of health left in you. But if someone who is much older, who doesn't have the luxury of being able to start planning for succession now, and maybe you could tell us a bit more about how succession planning would work. But for somebody who doesn't have that time, if they were in your situation and they were handed a £400,000 tax bill, what effect would that have? How would they pay that, and what would that mean?
So if I just inherited the farm, say my father had dropped dead tomorrow, or well, it's come April 26th, of course, because we've got that time before then, to try and find a £400,000 money, which is basically an investment for the farm, is that you've got to look at it that you are taking that farm on, and you are investing £400,000 to buy that farm on. It'd be nigh impossible. Even running it over 20, 30 years, it would be incredibly difficult with the margins that there is with food production in this country, with farming in this country. You'd have to run it over so long. You'd have to see that as a rent that you are paying. The trouble is, a lot of family farms, there's this sort of level of hope, really, with each generation that they will get to take it on, and generally they are taking a very, very low wage. So there was the minimum wage announced yesterday. Most family farms will never ever get to see that sort of level of pay. They're working well below minimum wage, ridiculous hours, under the hope and the sort of expectation that they will receive the farm, when it comes to their sort of turn to inherit. So this has kind of thrown a big spanner in those works, really. That it was there's this level of expectation that it's quite hard to sort of describe, really, and understand, really, as to why farmers would do that. Why would you work for 30, 40 years potentially without actually knowing whether you're going to actually get that farm at the end of the day? So that's why we really need to start having those discussions far, far earlier than they have been in the past.
The suspicion is, James, that Labour maybe have a view of farming that it's quite lucrative. You are landowners. We have this cliche of farm owners at least being very well paid. And clearly, as you say, that isn't the case. This is just another cost on your business, which is already very, very tough.
Yeah, I think, there's farmers are asset rich and incredibly cash poor. There's the level of sort of pressures on farmers at the moment to produce food, to produce cheap. I can't even call it like good. Food at a good price is cheap food. That's what we're expected to do. Cheap food. We're asked to maintain and enhance the environment. We're asked to create habitats, clean water, clean air, all on a shoestring of a budget. Really, the budget was maintained yesterday. It was slightly increased because of the underspend from last term. A shoestring of a budget. We've got to do all those things, and then they're kind of trying to, sneakily get a bit more tax off us as well for those people that aren't prepared enough. Well, we as an industry, really, we're incredibly resilient and strong as an industry. So we need to include planning within that as well, and just trying to make sure that we don't get caught out by these sort of taxes. Unfortunately, you can't decide when you're going to drop off your perch, so that's the one thing that we can't control.
Do you think Labour understands farming?
I think some of them do. I don't think the Treasury do. I think they see farming as, that this 2.6 billion that we're getting is probably seen as a subsidy for farming, but it's absolutely not. We are, like I said, all those things that we have to deliver for farming on this 2.6 billion is immense.
That's the government money that they put into the farming sector.
Yeah, and so that is just for England. as well. Now I was at actually the Labour conference a couple of months ago, whenever it was, and I was in a session on water quality. There was someone from a large water company, and they were saying that they were going to invest £3 billion in the Manchester sewerage system alone, and championing that as if it was a great thing, and it is a great thing. But farming has to do all it's got to do on a smaller budget than one city, one area of the country. So really, I think we need more support in terms of, just for everything. So all the things that we're asked to do, all the nature-friendly farming things that we're expected to do, all the the stewardships, the ELMs, the SFIs, lots of acronyms, but they're all there to sort of enhance the environment. Farmers have an ability to do that, but we need that really long-term planning, really. And if we're able to see ourselves through the next 5-6 years, I think farm will be in an incredibly good place. But we need that long-term vision from government really to help us get to that.
James, what would you say to people? Maybe Rachel Reeves is one of them, who might say to people like you, "Well, you're just going to have to sell some land to pay this tax."
Yeah. Sell it to who? I suppose would be the thing.
Yeah.
My worry would be, so there has been a few people who have said that it might open up opportunities for new entrants into farming, which would be a good thing if it did. If that was the best thing to come out of the reforms to the inheritance tax, so then that would be it. My worry is though that without the capital, people can't borrow the sort of monies that we're talking of to buy farms or land, anyways, and also that it's much more likely to get snapped up by large investors, by companies, people that don't die, so they are never going to be liable for the inheritance tax on that, anyways. And a lot of that will be for green funding, for green finance. So it could be like BPF,
Solar farms, maybe.
Yeah, well, not so much that. It would be for things like, and I've got it written down because biodiversity net gain. Mine went blank. So biodiversity net gain for carbon, all that type of thing, and it would be more likely to be funded for that than it would be actual farmers buying that land and taking it on. And then there's also the worry that some large estates might not. They're also going to be liable for the new tax rules, for the new inheritance tax rules as well. It might be that they decide to sell off some of their farms with the tenants kicked off, so as they can gain some extra cash. And those are most likely to go to these large investors as well.
Listening to you, James, it sounds like this tax take could put at risk our food production.
It could. I mean, I think we as an industry, we really need to really make sure that it doesn't. I think we do hold we hold the keys to making it work. But there'll be some people that are, much older than me that will be really, really worried now at this point. If I felt worried, and I've got someone that I can hand it on to, and hopefully there's plenty of time to do that, then there will be many, many people that are incredibly worried that might decide to just stop farming, and food production is absolutely key, to long-term sustainability of our industry. So yeah, it does worry me a bit. It does, and it worries me because the returns are so low for primary food production in this farm as well. Like I said, 1 or 2% profit is tiny. So yeah, I think we need everybody to really realise how fragile the farming industry is. I think that's how we feel as a group of people now. I'd really hope that yesterday's budget would have really buoyed our spirits a bit, really. Whereas in reality, I think it does make us feel like we've just been a bit more sort of kicked a bit, really, to be honest. That's the sort of initial raw feelings, I think, as an industry. But when we look underneath the sort of bonnet of it, and we see the flood recovery payments, and we see that they have maintained the budget for the ELMs, for the environmental land management schemes and things, then hopefully we will see a much more positive outlook once we see beyond the initial sort of shock of it all.
Well, hopefully, James, some glimmers of hope there. But as you say, extra costs on an already fragile system. We really appreciate, first of all the work you do on producing food and looking after the land. And also to you, James, directly for joining the Daily Tea. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's have a look at another area also involving inheritance tax. And it's about all of our pension funds. So another big change that Rachel Reeves announced yesterday is that from 2027, private pensions will be subject to inheritance tax, although spouses will still be exempt from paying any inheritance tax. Our pension pots will be taxed at 40%. And that's as long as the total assets being passed on are large enough to attract inheritance tax, which means they have to be valued at over £325,000. But given that that is also likely to include your home, it is very likely that our pension funds for all pensioners could be trapped for the first time by inheritance tax. And it means there's been some estimates that this change could mean the cost. And of course, this is a cost borne by a family that will be in a situation of grief and dealing with the death of a loved one. That cost could be as much as £65,000 on average.
Well, we're joined now by Baroness Ros Altman, the former Pensions Minister, someone who will be familiar, no doubt, to many of our listeners. She served as Pensions Minister under David Cameron and Theresa May after a career in finance. She's a leading pensions expert and political campaigner, and she has said already in The Telegraph that introducing inheritance tax on private pensions could mean there will be new incentives for people to spend their fund quickly, leaving them poorer in their later years. So thanks for joining us, Ros. Can you just tell us what your biggest fear is for pensioners as a result of these changes?
Well, my biggest fear is that this change undoes what was a very, very sensible system of incentives put in with the pension freedoms around 2015. And it will now mean that there are incentives not to keep a pension for your 80s and 90s and to spend the money much too soon, which will result in poorer pensioners in future, less spending in the economy with an ageing population, and it is also likely to hit the pension prospects of younger generations who might otherwise have been able to inherit a pension from a parent who died unexpectedly young.
So people are going to have to try and second guess how long they're going to live, effectively, aren't they?
Well, I mean, that's always part of the problem with pensions. And the same thing applies if you're planning any long-term support for yourself or your family. But with the pension regime that has now been swept away, everybody was given a much greater opportunity to manage their own pension money in their own interest, take control of it, and have the confidence that it was safe to leave the money in the pension fund for their much later life, because they weren't frightened that they'd be hit with a massive penalty if they hadn't spent the money before they died. The old system had a penalty tax charge on any money that was left in what's called a drawdown fund. You know, if your pension fund is a certain size and you take money out on a regular basis or on a ad hoc basis, that drawdown fund, if you hadn't spent it all, was subject to 55% tax on death. What you're now going to find is that any money you haven't spent, if you die before your 80s and 90s and don't live to a ripe old age, is going to initially lose 40%, that is going to pass straight away to the revenue. And then potentially when your loved ones want to take the money out, they will be hit by a further tax charge on the amount that they withdraw. So you still have this massive disincentive for people to keep the money for their later life, which originally is supposed to be the whole idea of pensions. And if you don't want to buy an annuity, because very often they're not good value, and again, if you die young, the annuity will normally die with you, then you've lost the opportunity that has been there for quite some time to make provision for the future generations, which means that not only will you potentially be poorer, but your loved ones could be if you die earlier than expected. And that is a fundamental undoing of the value of pensions, which I don't think people have yet appreciated.
Ros, it's a disincentive as well to more saving into your pension whilst you're working. And the whole problem has been for the United Kingdom is people not saving enough for when they retire, when they might have other costs, which may be the care costs, which also haven't been solved over many decades by many different governments. This seems to be a disincentive to saving for a pension whilst you're working.
Well, it's a disincentive to make any of these kind of long-term plans for younger people. If they've seen that, let's say, their parents or even their grandparents spent a huge sum of money taking careful financial advice when this new regime was put in, and had everything, all their ducks in a row, and you know, had worked hard to make those plans, and then they see that a new government can just come in and sweep that away in a pretty short space of time. You know, if you're making plans for the next 30 years, changing it every few years, it just makes the whole exercise of financial planning almost impossible for the long run. So as you say, people will think, well, why would I want to put the money into a pension at all? And instead of having this system where you're not frightened to keep money for your 80s and 90s, people will be precisely encouraged to say, well, that's not what I want to do. I want to, you know, might as well enjoy the money now, because the tax I pay when I take it out might even be less than that suffered by anyone I leave it to, and I can, you know, benefit from it straight away. If people were keeping the money to their 80s and 90s, which was the opportunity that the previous arrangements offered, once we hopefully one day get some kind of proper policy for funding social care, that money could have formed part of that whole planning. Now you're going to find lots more people in future will reach their 80s and 90s, which is typically the time that you would need some care, without the money in the pension funds they otherwise would have had, because they were frightened to keep it for fear of the tax. The whole system was really sensible, and yet now it's just been swept away.
We've been taking some letters from our wonderful readers, and there's one person has made the exact point that you make. This is a letter from Simon Hargreaves from Kingsley in Hampshire, and he says, "Sir, the Chancellor announced in the budget that self-invested personal pensions, SIP, will be subject to inheritance tax from April 2025. This is immoral and unfair. I had a sizable final salary pension, which, after seeking guidance, just as you said, Ros, seeking guidance from several professional financial advisors, I chose to convert into a SIP. The driving factor for my decision was that this pot sits outside of my estate for inheritance tax purposes. This was a strategic financial decision based on professional advice, not exploiting a loophole, as you've said, Gordon, in the past. They also use that language about farmers, not exploiting a loophole. I was being savvy." Mr. Hargreaves continues, "Rachel Reeves's announcement has stripped away the primary reason for my decision to cash in my defined benefit pension, has left me with a lower income for life, and has denied my children a significant amount of inheritance. I despair."
Absolutely right. The only thing I would correct on that is that it won't be till 2027. Those changes have been designed to at least give people a bit of time to try and make other plans. But if you have indeed, and this is something I put in my Telegraph article today, if you have taken the time and trouble and cost to transfer some money out of a defined benefit pension scheme in order to take back control of your own money and be able to pass it on to loved ones if you don't need it later on, those plans have been completely scuppered, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't go back into the defined benefit pension scheme. So, this is a retrospective hit for a lot of people. Now, of course, the government probably is not too concerned about people who might have tens or even hundreds of thousands of pounds in their own pension fund. But this is part of the problem we've got, which is you want to encourage more people to have more money in pensions, and these constant tinkering changes end up putting people off. We finally had a system that was encouraging more people to put money in. You've got automatic enrolment in the workplace, which brings people into pensions, and then you have an opportunity for helping them understand, that there are really enormous benefits in having money growing in a pension rather than in another type of tax-free or taxable account. But the fear is that this is just the first budget, and this is one change. Are we going to have more? The government's doing a big pension review. There's no certainty, and you can't plan for the long term when there isn't any confidence that things are not going to suddenly change. And the example you've just given from someone who did transfer from a defined benefit pension scheme for all the sensible reasons that he cited, and at significant cost probably to himself, just feels, what was the point? And I'm stuck. And that's just, to me, not fair and very off-putting to others who might otherwise want to plan their pension retirement.
Yeah. Ros, is there any advice you can give to people right now who might be sort of despairing at these changes? Is there anything they can do to mitigate what Rachel Reeves has done?
Well, I mean, there will be different retirement planning, estate planning wheezes, if you like, that people will need to go to a financial advisor to discuss. This is great news for financial advisors in many ways. But if you leave the money to your partner, your civil partner, or your spouse, not to someone you're living with, though, by the way, so that's an important thing to note. If you leave the money to the partner, it does pass tax-free. But of course, then if the partner wants to leave it to children or other loved ones, it will face this problem.
They'd have to get remarried, wouldn't they, to try and pass it on to the new partner, and so on and so on.
It's really, you can't get back into a defined benefit scheme that you gave up. If you want to take money out of your pension fund now, having not planned to do so because it was the last money you should spend under the old system, you do need to be careful about the tax consequences. You can take up to £50,000 if you have no other income, but if you've got a state pension and some other income, as long as your pension withdrawal keeps you under an annual sum of £50,000, 271, you will only pay 20% tax on that withdrawal. So, I guess people might be incentivized to try and do that now, which is not the purpose of a pension. But in the end, pensions get massive tax breaks to encourage you to build this fund up. And tax does have an impact on pension planning. You can't get away from it. And this has made it far more difficult to help extol the benefits of pensions and bring more people into the pension system, which I think risks more poor pensioners in the long term, lower spending in the economy, and is not really, in my view, a growth boosting move.
Ros, Labour has got form here, hasn't it? Famously,
Yeah.
in the 1997 Blair Brown government, Gordon Brown completely changed the way that pensions were dealt with through the tax system. And many people said that was the start of the destruction of the pension system. What is Labour's problem with people having private pensions that seems to mean that every time it comes into power, it does something with such broad and one assumes unintended consequences, though sometimes I wonder. Is there a political issue here? You think that Labour just cannot keep their hands off people's pensions savings?
I think there's a political issue here, which is that if you're in an unfunded public sector pension scheme, you don't have the opportunity to have a big pot of money. So you're not impacted in the way that the private sector is by this change. And of course, the people who really are most affected will tend to have a lot of money in a pension fund. And I don't think that this government is concerned about them. Indeed, it wants to, if you like, hit them in some way. We saw that with the winter fuel payment, by the way. You know, the Treasury has taken away the winter fuel payment from the very wealthiest pensioners because they shouldn't have had it in the first place. And I agree, it should certainly never have been tax-free for the top earners of pensioners. But that has meant they've also had to take it away from the very poorest.
Really interesting thoughts there from Ros Altman. Just one thing, we've talked about this, haven't we, Gordon? There is a real differential growing between those people who work in the public sector and the majority of us who work in the private sector, in pensions, as Ros Altman was saying just then, but also in lots of public sector workers, although of course the national insurance contributions increase for employers does affect the public sector, Rachel Reeves has put in a huge amount of money into the public sector to shield those workers from the effects, the jobs tax effects of that NICS change. And so if you're in the public sector, your pay, which on average is already higher than private sector pay, is going to be protected and go up above the level of inflation. So the gap between public sector workers who have very good pensions and private sector workers is going to grow.
Yeah, and I was fascinated by the point she made there about this idea that you could use the tax system to encourage investment in the UK. It does feel as though there's just been a lack of imagination from Labour, and that their instinct is always just to punish people who they think have got too much money.